you once upon a time had the end of a barrel of a shotgun in your mouth.
It was a 38, nickel-plated 38, loaded with federal hydroshock hollow points. Somebody asked me what it tastes like, and I said, relief. When I put the gun in my mouth with the federal hydroshock hollow points in the chamber, chances are you're not coming back.
Welcome to the Better Human Podcast. My name is Greg Witz, and each week we're going to be bringing you some incredible and inspiring guests and topics that are going to take your life to the next level. Thanks for spending time with us. Sit back and enjoy the show. Frank, what's going on, my friend?
I have just gotten back from a 30-minute walk with 32 pounds of sand in a vest wrapped around my body.
Well, you're an insane dude, we've recently met and, in our first conversation, you're a competing bodybuilder.
Yep.
You were telling me that you were coming off a fast of 24 or 36 or 48 hours, some shit like that.
Yep.
And then you're always on the move. And I want to talk about that because that's a huge part of sort of what your mental exercise is when it comes down to mental health. But I want to, kick off with this. When we were chatting, you told me a story that blew my mind. And the story began with you saying that you once upon a time had the end of a barrel of a shotgun in your mouth.
Actually, it was a 38, nickel-plated 38, loaded with federal hydroshock hollow points.
There you go. So you had steel at the end of your teeth.
Yes. Somebody asked me what it tastes like, and I said, relief.
Wow. So take me back there. I mean, let's start the conversation with your story around that.
Well, I've been doing comedy for a long time. We can go back later to the beginning of my comedy career in fourth grade.
Yeah.
But I'd done comedy for 10 years, a little radio, morning show, co-host kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then the club comedy scene died or is dying. But I've always been very clean. So I figured I could do corporate comedy, the rubber chicken circuit, they call it in the US, after dinner, after lunch at conventions.
Right.
And I did that from 95 to 2007 and was making, as Seinfeld calls it, stupid money. I was getting $5,000 for 45 minutes of comedy. I know. That's what a country.
You know what? Hey, they say laughter is the best medicine. So, sometimes it's worth paying for that. But you're running this circuit, and the joke about comedians is they're pretty depressed personalities behind the scenes. You think of the clown on the outside; it's painted happy and is there to entertain and show and excite. But beneath that is the sadness and the stuff that we don't get to see, right?
Well, a friend of mine, now deceased, not of suicide by natural causes, a comedian from Canada, Mike McDonald, he had an expression. There are two kinds of comedians, diagnosed and undiagnosed.
Huh.
So everything was going well until 2007. Then the recession hit, the world economy crashed, and my wife and I lost everything we'd worked for in 25 years in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. And it just devastated her, which was killing me. That was, if I'd been single, I could have just told the bank to take a flying leap. Here's the property back. Fine. But I decided that I could restore her financially because I had $1 million life insurance policy. So that's when I learned what the barrel of my gun tasted like. Excuse me. I wanted to practice. So I went to the barn, put the gun in my mouth, pulled the hammer back to see if I could do it. The reason I didn't do it was I'd sold insurance right out of college, and I knew that my life insurance policy had a 2-year suicide clause. Kill yourself in less than 2 years, pays nothing. After 2 years, $1 million. So I called my insurance agent, asked him, hey, man, how long have I had that policy?
Mm-hmm.
He says, I don't know, I'll check. And he's checking, you can hear him. And then he comes back on the phone and goes, 22 months and no, don't do it. Because he's had conversations like that where he had told the person policy's in force, and then he ended up delivering a check. So oddly, my life insurance policy saved my life, and I didn't mark the days off the calendar. I had 2 months to wait to kill myself, but I didn't, mark days off the calendar. And when 2 months passed, I don't recall the day coming when it was in full force. And so fortunately, things must have gotten a little better. Yeah. Phone call stopped.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And this took you from, call it, comedy into the work that you do today, which is mental health, suicide prevention, and really understanding. And that's what I want to explore today. Because, my ex-partner, who was a clinical psychologist, once said to me, because it happened something close to us, we were interviewing someone and went through a couple of interviews, and I think the role was going to be, facilitator and coach. Anyway, it finally came down to it. It was denied, right? Like, no, we're not gonna bring this guy on. And he went home on that weekend, and he committed suicide. And on Monday, I found out, and I felt awful. And this was the point of the story, which was, my ex-partner said, listen, don't be so narcissistic, right? It wasn't because of, you, right? Suicide is an extremely rational, logical, factual, sterile, unemotional thing to do. It is extremely, in some cases, clearing. And it took me a while to process that and understand that. But, explain that to me. Talk me through that.
Well, it is a rational response to an irrational situation, I guess. And most people who are suicidal, suffer from something called burdensomeness. They believe firmly that the world would be better off without them. So people say suicide, that's selfish. Well, from the outside looking in, absolutely. From the inside looking out, it's almost selfless. I mean, I was going to kill myself. My wife would be brokenhearted, but she would no longer be broke.
Right. And that's what I was going to say. Like, to do this wasn't out of anger, which never is, because anger would actually create you to survive. It's out of, let me do this for others, right? My wife will be looked after financially. She won't be burdened with my stress and my nonsense and my shit that I'm dealing with. She's young enough to maybe go on and build another relationship, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with this guy with us, it was exactly that. It was a financial decision that because he was unemployed and all these things were happening, it became a very, for my kids and my wife, I'm going to leave them financially stable and secure.
Yes. Irrational after fashion, but it's certainly a logical conclusion. If you believe that the world would be better off without you, and many people do.
Right.
Something else that's a bit misunderstood is that people say, why would he want to kill himself? He had so much to live for. Well, chances are he didn't want to kill himself. He just wanted to end the pain. I didn't want to kill myself. I just simply wanted to end the pain. And Naomi Judd, country music superstar, passed away a couple of months ago. And people would ask me, she had everything, money and a career. And, why would someone like that want to die? Well, chances are she didn't want to die. She just simply wanted to end the pain.
Right. Explain that to me. So pain, what do you mean? Mental anguish, anxiety, stress?
All those things, depression.
Yeah.
I mean, there are physical, when I get depressed, it feels like somebody's got their hands wrapped around my heart and they're squeezing. So there is a physical element to my mental discomfort. And I got really depressed yesterday. I cycled down late in the day and it was all I could do to put one foot in front of the other. I just wanted to go crawl in bed, pull the covers over my head and wait for the sun to come up the next day. And that's at 3 PM. So it's a heaviness. It's like somebody's turning up the force of gravity and it's harder and harder to put one foot in front of the other. And the benefit I have being 65 and having been through that cycle so many times is that I know my cycle is generally 1 to 3 days. So when I start to cycle down, I know at most 72 hours from now, I'm going to be cycling back up. So the danger, younger people who haven't been through it a number of times can't logically figure out that it's only a visitor, it's going to leave. And the thought process is, look, if life's not going to be any better than this right this moment, why bother? Why go on? If this is as good as it gets, I might as well end it. So, but being old,
you've learned how to
haven't been through it. So, and mine's not situational. Many people, depression is not situational. I've been most depressed at some of the best times in my life. House paid off, bookings, money in the bank, lovely wife. Just it's a cycle like a flat spot on a wheel. It just comes up every now and then. It's a major depressive disorder, is what it's called.
Yeah. Are you depressed now?
No, I was yesterday.
Yeah. Okay.
It was, I mean, it's all I could do.
Cycling back up now, right?
It's cycling back. Woke up this morning feeling pretty good. So yeah, it's just the other thing I have is called chronic suicidal ideation, which is far more rare. Mm-hmm. It means for people like me, people in my tribe, the option of suicide is always an option on the menu as a solution for problems large and small. I tell the audience, when I say small, my car broke down a couple of years ago. I had 3 thoughts unbidden. 1, get it fixed. 2, buy a new one. 3, I could just kill myself. That's chronic suicide. It's a coping mechanism. It's a way for your brain. We can fix this. We can end the pain of this. The upside of that, by the way, is the upside, Greg, is every time I've spoken since 2014, there's been at least one person in the audience who has chronic suicidal ideation. They don't know it has a name. They think they're just some kind of freak and completely alone. I did a college presentation. A young woman came up afterwards. Hey, thanks for your keynote. I said, you're welcome. She goes, but I got to tell you, it made me weep. How did it make you weep? She said, well, you know, your story about the car getting fixed, buy a new one or kill yourself. I've been having those thoughts all my life. I didn't know it was a thing. I thought it was just me and I was some kind of freak and all alone. And when I heard you say that out loud, I realized for the first time in my life that I am not, in fact, alone, and I wept. Wow. There's a ROI for you.
Wow. Wow. What talk about comfort in seeking, call it community, which is, you know, I'm not this isolated, weird unicorn somewhere on the island. There's other people that understand and go through this. So you said that's your diagnosis in suicide. Are there other types of suicidal personalities, like
suicidal ideation? Yes.
Ideation. Sorry, I was grasping for the word. Suicide ideation. So yours is this. What's it defined as again?
Chronic suicidal ideation. It runs in my family. It's called generational depression and suicide.
Okay.
There are I have a friend who was just diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and one of the 9 symptoms is suicidality, meaning the occasional thought of suicide, but not as mine is, as a coping mechanism. It's just gets very depressed and then has the thought of suicide.
Right. That becomes the one of the options on the table in stressful situations, as you said, small or big, you know, big, major life crisis, financial crisis, little, small, my car breaks down. Wow.
Ironically, my chronic suicidal ideation helps keep me alive because I've already made the decision that I could kill myself at any moment. I'm willing to cross that barrier. Right. And I believe suicide is all about pain. I can stand a great deal more pain knowing that I'm in control of the situation, that I can end it anytime I like. I had a friend of mine say to me, you know, if it weren't for my chronic suicidal ideation, I'd have killed myself a long time ago.
Wow.
I go, interesting way to put it, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. You mentioned borderline personalities, which sits on the spectrum of personality disorders, right? And we know with personality disorders, it's a spectrum, right? It goes from sort of, you know, light all the way to severe, and borderline, which is impulsive, narcissistic, right? Psychopathic, all the way to the other end, which is more like the passive aggressive type of personality. Are there other types of personalities that are prone to suicide?
Well, the most dangerous, I believe, from my research, is in living with bipolar disorder. Because, and I think I can't prove this, but I think the lows in what you used to call manic depressive, now bipolar disorder, the lows seem much lower because the highs were so much higher. So the bandwidth between the two, you know, the contrast between the high, the manic state, and then the depressive state, although there's a magic state in the middle, hypomania, which is you're charismatic and energetic. You don't need a lot of sleep. You don't need to eat a lot. You're very productive. It's very seductive, that state. The trick is remaining at that altitude. People tend to either slip up into mania or down into the depressive state. It's been really hard over the decades to regulate. And then what they tended to do was they tended to put you a little bit in the depressive state, so you're not so close to the manic state where you're psychotic and having delusions.
Right.
So, and if you get into that hypomania, because it is such an attractive state of mind, people stop taking their medication because you're so productive. I'm doing so much.
Right. And then you crash.
And then you crash, or you slip into mania, and all of a sudden you're seeing things, hearing things, feeling things that aren't there.
You were mentioning before the examples you gave in suicide. The individual that came up to you at the end of your keynote was a female. The person that just killed themselves, country singer.
Yeah, Naomi Judd.
But suicide is more common for males, right? Isn't something like 80% of suicide is male?
The completion of a suicide is more common for males.
Okay. So that's the difference. So both males and females can equally, in quotations, have those suicidal thoughts, but it's males 80% that actually follow through with it.
Actually, no. 3 times as many women attempt. Men complete more often because they use a firearm.
Wow. So what's common for females? I mean, how would they try to pills? Okay.
Cutting themselves.
Yeah.
Things where you could do it, and then you could call 911 or call a loved one and go, hey, you got to come over here and help me. I've taken all these pills, or things that you could actually come back from. When I put the gun in my mouth with a federal hydroshock hollow points in the chamber,
right,
chances are you're not coming back.
Right.
But 8 out of 10 suicides, you are correct, nowadays roughly, are men. And one of the big reasons is what they call nowadays, they call it toxic masculinity. But when I was a kid growing up in the southern United States, it was big boys don't cry, which I think is far more descriptive.
Wow. And what we were talking about before, which is, as males are taught to, in some cases, not express emotion and show that sort of side and humility. And as we were saying, big boys don't cry, and I am man and I bury emotions, and all that trauma and stuff. What we call is internalized stress, internalized emotion, internalized trauma manifests later. And if you don't have coping mechanisms and you don't understand how to deal with it, this is where you start to see more of males being affected by suicide.
Yep. And one of the benefits of what I do, my clients tell me all the time, we just brought you in here to start the conversation because hardly anybody, even though one person dies by suicide in the US every 9 minutes and around the world every 40 seconds, hardly anybody talks about it unless you bring it up. And then almost everybody has a story. I was in Cincinnati. I was working for a construction company, doing a keynote on site, and where they're rebuilding, rehabilitating, they're renovating a hospital.
Okay.
180 guys. I tell my story about the gun and coming so close and so forth. I get done and I do a general Q&A, and I tell them, look, if you got a question you want to ask me, you don't want to ask me in front of everybody, or you want to share a story, I'll hang out for another 30, 45 minutes, talk to everybody individually. So I get done, and this gentleman comes up, black, mid-20s, I'm guessing. Mm-hmm. And I look up, and he's crying in front of all these people, all this other 179 construction workers. And he's crying so hard he can't speak. So I wait. And when he can gather himself, he says that he has trouble sleeping. He hadn't slept in a couple of days. He said he works on the 5th floor of the building, and he thinks about jumping off every day. And I said, well, what's happened in the last? And he said, well, in the last year, he had lost 3 people close to him to violence, including his daughter, who died in his arms. Oh. Now, this is something he has told no one up to this point. But by going on stage and being vulnerable and, sharing my story, he felt comfortable enough to come up in front of all these people. So I walked him over to the gentleman who was there from HR and said, listen, I asked him if he'd be willing to, go with you. I think you need to take him to a mental health facility immediately, get him evaluated, perhaps medicated, because he is circling the drain. So that's the power. Men, I did a show in New York for the big construction company, a building in downtown Manhattan. So I think I did 7 keynotes in 2.5 days. It was crazy. But the meeting planner was sitting at the back of the room, watching everybody watching me. He said, Frank, 2 things. One, I noticed, mostly men again, male heavy. He goes, number 1, I realized at some point, none of them were looking at their smartphones. That's a metric nowadays.
That is huge. I actually, when I speak and run same thing. It's how many people are eyes locked on you.
Yeah, and not their phones. The second thing was I was telling a story about why I don't kill myself. And he said, I'm watching the guy next to me, big burly iron worker. And the story is gripping and touching. And he said, I'm watching the iron worker's face, and all of a sudden, out of the corner of the iron worker's eye, rolls one tear down his cheek. Not sobbing, but obviously I got to him. The story got to him. So that's why I do what I do.
You know, I was going to say, man, like you save lives directly and indirectly. And you know what I love hearing you talk a lot about is it is through your storytelling and expression, right? One is probably therapeutic, and I make a joke when I do training and coaching. People are like, how do you do this all the time? And you have this is my therapy in the room right now. Like, you know, as I'm telling my stories and using them as examples between my relationship, my kids, my business, my that, it's freeing. And I learned this a long time ago, you know, which is it's been coined as the talking cure, you know, talk therapy. That's the joke we make about the confession booth, which I tell a story, and it goes like this. It says, you know, one day guy walks into church, right? Looks around, right? Quite quiet, walks up to the confession booth, says, you know, I've seen this stuff before, and sits down, and the window opens and says, hello, you know, how may I help you? And goes, well, I'm not really sure why I'm here. And it's kind of, this is my first time being here. And they said, well, why don't you just tell me what brought you in here today? Well, and they begin to talk, right? And the story goes on for a little bit. And at the end, you are forgiven and you may leave. Anyway, next week, same guy comes back, walks in there, beelines to the confession booth this time. He says, window opens. He says, great, I'm glad you're back. So what I wanted to talk about was I wanted to share what happened this week. First, I thought sinful things. Second, I did some bad shit. Third, I did this. Third, I shouldn't have done that. Blah, 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 blah. And the priest says, you are forgiven and you may go. Guy walks out again. Anyway, week 3, week 4, week 5, same thing. Anyway, next thing you know, the priest looks over at one point and says, wow, you know, you're really, you know, getting into this. He turns around, he says something along the lines, and he says, you know, I got to tell you, this shit's really great. I'm not even Catholic, but like coming in here each week and telling my story and being forgiven, right, is so freeing. And I'm so motivated that week. I think I'm good. I'll see you next month, right? And that is the joke about therapy, which is if more of us spoke, and I think the danger in our ability to express is no one listens. You know, even when you're on stage and you're talking and people are listening, right? And then they come up to you. One of the key things that you said, and I heard you say, was like, I listened to them. You know, I waited for the guy to stop hyperventilating and crying and snot bubbling, and I gave him that space. And in giving him that space, the story came about his daughter. Which if you fucked up in that moment and then said, don't worry, man, it's okay, stop crying, it's okay, blah, 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 blah. All you would have done is taken all that trauma and stress and shoved it back down, right?
Yeah.
And you know, this is also the other side of this thing. There's a responsibility for us as individuals to recognize that we have to go there and we have to talk. We have to start to express, and you know, it could be in extreme ways and it could be in a little lighter ways. But the other side of this coin is we have a huge responsibility to listen and to recognize and to be aware of when, hold on a second, I need to shut up right now, because if I disrupt this flow, it's just going to create a block, right?
Yes. And I was talking to a guy on the phone because I give out my cell phone number every time I keynote, put it up on the screen. I said, look, if you're suicidal, call dial 988, which is a new 3-digit number in the US, or text the word help to 741-741 if you're younger, because younger people are more forthcoming in text. I said, if you're just having a bad day, call a crazy person. Here's my phone number. I got a call one day. I was terribly depressed, having thoughts of suicide. Somewhere in the conversation, and this is where listening comes. Comedians really get paid to listen and then report back. The talking is just, you know, the finished product. He says to me somewhere in the conversation, yeah, I just stopped by Amtrak, picked up a train schedule. Well, if you're neurotypical, that's probably not going to set off alarm bells. But if the guy's depressed and suicidal, he's picking up a train schedule, I go, look, I'm not one of those guys that says to you, promise me you're not going to kill yourself. I'm not going to ask you to promise me not to kill yourself. What I am going to ask you to do is please don't do it that way. Because the moment you step up on the tracks, you're probably going to lock eyes with the engineer. You're going to end your life and ruin theirs. So, if do me a favor, just don't go that way. And that's the benefit of listening.
Wow. And as I'm listening to you now, I'm like, the guy probably went, oh shit, that's pretty selfish of me to do that.
Yes, exactly.
Suicide's the opposite of that, right? Suicide is no, I don't want to burden people, right?
Yeah.
Wow. So when it comes down to suicide prevention, right?
Yeah.
Being aware and listening to these things is one thing. What are some other practices, or what are other pieces of advice and ways we can be more aware around this stuff?
How about some good news, Greg? The good news is 8 out of 10 people on average who are suicidal are ambivalent, can't make up their mind. 9 out of 10 give hints in the last week leading up to an attempt, meaning the vast majority of people can be saved. The vast majority of people want to be saved. It's the most preventable cause of death on the planet. You don't have to be a clinician to stop a suicide. What you do have to do is know how to start the conversation. That's what I teach. I teach the audience some signs and symptoms of depression and thoughts of suicide, what to do, what to say, and how to find resources.
So share some of that right now. So what are the signs, and what do we do, and what are those resources, and what could be some things that the audience can walk away with going, okay, I'm gonna be more aware from this.
Yes, signs. My 3 favorite signs are of depression. The person eats too much, or they cannot eat. They sleep too much, or they cannot sleep. They tend to have trouble starting up, getting cranked up, get out of bed in the morning, but then in the afternoon they rally and they're like a different person. And the other one is you can see this visually, is they let their personal hygiene go. They're normally pretty well put together, but lately their hair's been kind of dirty, the clothes aren't quite so clean. It may be because they're having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, getting in the shower, and running a little wash. So I say to the audience, look, here's what you don't say to somebody who you think, and I say, go with your gut. If your intuition tells you, if the word depression pops in your mind when you see this person, chances are you've been picking up signals, signs. Here's what you don't say. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Turn that frown upside down. Here's my personal favorite. Choose joy. I said to the guy who told me that, unless you're talking about dishwashing liquid, I'm pretty much out of luck. It's not a matter of choosing joy. Now, here's what you do say. I'm here for you and I mean it. I know that depression is in fact a mental illness. The good news is with time and treatment, things will get better. I'll take the time. I'll help you get the treatment. And here's the toughest part. You have to ask them in no uncertain terms, just like this, are you having thoughts of suicide? What if they're not forthcoming, but your gut tells you they're circling the drain? Well, there are signs that they may be, in fact, suicidal. One is they talk about death and dying. You catch them Googling death and dying, how to kill yourself, Googling that. Death and dying appears as a theme in their artwork or their music or their writing. They're getting their affairs in order, especially if they're giving away prized possessions, because they want to make sure the possessions go to the people they want them to go to when they're gone. And they're gathering the means to die by suicide, whether it's stockpiling medication or buying a firearm. Here's one that's counterintuitive and terribly dangerous. They've been depressed for a long time, and now they're happy for no apparent reason. Well, the danger is they may be happy because they've chosen time, place, and method, and they know the pain is finite. So that's now, let's say they do say they're having thoughts of suicide. You say, do you have a plan? And if they have a plan as detailed time, place, and method, then ideally they will allow you to take them to a mental health facility simply for evaluation and perhaps medication. And I always recommend you also have a physical, because I have a friend here in town, terribly depressed, had a physical. Turns out his body wasn't metabolizing iron properly. They put him on a time-release iron supplement and the symptoms disappeared.
Wow.
Sometimes physical ailments present as mental health issues.
Right.
Now, let's say they're suicidal. They got a plan, but it's not really specific. What do you do? Well, I would say, okay, tell me, are you going to kill yourself? And if they say no, you say, okay, tell me why not. Make them give voice to whatever it is that's keeping them here, because something is keeping them here.
Mm-hmm. Really good. So all questions again, that whole theme is seeking to understand, seeking information, questioning, which also triggers their ability to process the situation as well, right? They start to think through things. I wanted to ask, in the times that we're living, considering the fact that, the world's a pretty stressed place, is there an increase in suicides? And are we seeing suicides happening at a younger age as well? Like, have you seen, like, if you look at the data over the last, call it 50 years, has it gone from, a certain age bracket committing suicide? And we now start to see a larger spectrum of that, where you're seeing teenagers and young adults.
Yes. And yes, during the pandemic, they were expecting a lot more suicides. And turns out overall suicides went down 1.5 points. The only place it went up, the only demographic or demographics were teenagers and college students went up. The last study I read said that 40% of high school students and 60% of college students self-report anxiety, stress, and depression, which is actually twice what it was 10 years ago.
And is that because we're seeing, Dan Pina calls it snowflakes. We're seeing the absence of resilience and the ability to face stress. Are we raising kids softer, basically, or?
I don't think so. I've had people tell me I need to take resilience classes or resiliency classes, and I said, look, the people that I know are the most resilient are my friends who are the most suicidal, because if they were not, they would not be here. Yeah, for people with suicidality, resilience is not the issue. Yeah, because the only reason we're still here. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine who has borderline personality disorder, and he gets depressed and suicidal. And he said to me, I wish my ex-wife could just get into my head. And I said, I've told my current wife that a number of times. If as I'm spiraling down, right. If the Vulcan mind meld was a thing, Spock used to do, my mind, your mind, your mind, my mind. Right. You could crawl into my head just for 5 minutes. You would come out screaming. How do you survive that? It's just
wow.
But yeah, so it's no. I think part of the problem, Greg, is and I can't say this is causation, but I do believe there is a connection. In the United States in 2012, the number of households in which there was at least one smartphone crossed the 50% mark. Okay. Now it's something like 85 or 6%. And if you look at the self-reported rates of depression and thoughts of suicide in teenagers and college students, the two graphs track like this. As the smartphone ownership went up, so did. And my last TED Talk was called Digital Media Addiction, Smartphones, Social Media, Anxiety, Stress, and Suicide. Mm-hmm. Because of the screen time and the problems, like for young women with Instagram and body image, mm-hmm. and the lack of person-to-person contact. Young women nowadays, 2020, I think it was, compared to 2012, spending 40% less time with their peers in a situation like at the mall, just hanging out. Right. They spend that time, of course, in their room staring at the screen. Right. So there's a lack of that connection, when you're looking in somebody's eyes, there's a neural connection.
I've been saying this for a while. We have never been more disconnected in such a connected world.
Yes, I've said that myself.
Right? It's crazy. I'm in Costa Rica and it's exquisite, right? And it's also voted one of the happiest places in the world, and it's a blue zone. And I was just back in Toronto for the last month. My energy was very different, very, very, very different. And what I mean by that is I feel myself being more present and open and less stressed in this type of environment. It's a big thing to watch the sunset here, and you're on the equator. So the sunset goes down 15 minutes, and it's the same time every single day, 12 months a year, sunrise, sunset. And it's a moment, wherever you are at the end of the day, you're coming back on the boat, or, you might be on the beach, or you might just be sitting at home outside, and, it's right before dinner, and 5:30, you sit and you watch. And I can't tell you how many people I see and how much I notice it right now, which people are barrel down here and they pull out their phones and they're filming the sunset. Now, don't get me wrong. I've set my phone up on time lapse to film a thing, but I set it up in time lapse and I sit back and I watch it, and people are digesting this experience through the screen, and all they got to do is just move that thing out of their face, and it's a completely different energy. And yeah, it's, we might say, in my opinion, in your opinion, yes, I think screen and social and all this stuff has created way more or contributed way more to this topic of suicide and depression. And even just the stat that you said, 40% less young girls are going to go and congregate and hang out and socialize. We're human beings. We're built to be in community and to see each other and to look at each other. People forget, a few years ago, and you'll appreciate this, you would sit at a restaurant and you'd look around the table next to you, and whether it was a family or a group of friends, they would all be looking at their phone. And, there was this game that came up at one point, which is you would all put your phone in the middle, right? And it would go zzz, zzz, and all phones would be buzzing, and whoever picked up their phone first paid for dinner. Right? And you would see how long it would take for people to not do so. Simon Sinek talks a lot about this as well, which is, the danger of this phone.
Well, and I was working a cruise ship not long ago, before the pandemic. And I'm working them again, by the way. And if I get to Costa Rica, I'll let you know I'm coming. We can do a cup of coffee.
We will
watch the sunset.
Sure.
But I'm standing on the deck, the Lido deck, by the Lido pool.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking around and I'm thinking, what's different? And I realized everybody was talking to everybody else. The only device was a couple of people in chaise lounges with an ebook reader, a Kindle, no
Right.
phones,
Right.
None. And I'm sad to say, today in my newsfeed, Carnival on one of their ships is now offering very inexpensive, truly high-speed internet where you can get back on your phone on the ship. So that's kind of the beginning of the end, of that.
Yeah.
Well, and I've also said that when I wake up in the morning, I do a double shot of espresso and I lay back down. And it's very dark. I mean, I get up really early. It's very dark. There's not a lot of sensory input. And I just close my eyes and I let my mind go wherever it will, for sometimes up to an hour, just drifting. And I'm very creative in those moments. If somebody wants a tagline for their business, I'll put that question in my head at night, go to sleep. And oftentimes in that hour, it just bubbles up. And I read a study somewhere in Scandinavia where the scientists who did the study said that we are losing the ability to do nothing. And it occurred to me, how often is anybody nowadays in the developed world actually alone with their thoughts? No earbuds, just their brain. And it's very rare.
Very rare. And they say this with kids as well. It's good for kids to be bored, because that is where their imagination is developed. Frank, you'll appreciate this. When we grew up, there was none of this. You created games. You discovered things in your mind. You went out. Although you see kids playing this game now, which is called Lava Floor, which is don't step here because the floor is lava, and right. So, but that kind of stuff, right? Okay, Frank, what else do you do for mental health? Meditation, physically working out, you drink two shots of espresso every morning. It sounds
take a little
some reflection and meditation. But what else do you do, and what else would be good practices and not answers, which is do this and this will fix you, but I want to remind people that what we got to start doing is practicing things, and what starts to work. Okay, for the audience, by the way, Frank is showing me a picture of himself, and he is a bodybuilder, by the way. He is this insane bodybuilder, which you cannot tell from his head right now sitting on the Zoom screen and his virtual background. And when we see him in meetings, you're usually wearing sort of big bulky shirt. You get more shirt. You know what? I'm going to send you one of these shirts. These are very form-fitting. I think you'll do well in them. Hey, so sorry to interrupt, and thank you for listening. I hope you're enjoying the show. If you like today's episode and you want to learn more about some of our programs, like the Better Leader program that can change your life, go ahead and click the link below.
Yeah, I've threatened to write a book called Look Good Naked, because when I wear my clothes, nobody can tell, that.
Right. And Frank, how old are you at?
65.
65. Well, for the audience, the picture that he just showed me, he looked like he was, 42 on steroids.
Yeah, that's well, and what at the beginning of the pandemic, it occurred to me, as someone living with mental illness and high functioning, that I was particularly well suited for the pandemic, because I actually created a keynote that I did a number of times virtually called Social Distancing and Staying Sane. Don't worry so much about your mentally ill friends, because my mentally ill friends who are high functioning all have a self-care plan that they practice every day, because we as mentally ill wake up in an uncertain world, whether there's a pandemic or not. So I spent these keynotes teaching neurotypical people how to create a simple self-care plan, because, that was the first pandemic. Is monkeypox the second? We don't know yet. Mm-hmm. So it's really simple. It's diet. I'm on the keto diet, and I do intermittent fasting. Exercise. I exercise pretty much every day. Good night's sleep is restorative. It's a shame, I think, that people brag about how little sleep they can get by on. Mm-hmm. We're not meant to run on empty.
Yeah, a friend said to me the other day, just to jump in, which is like, "Hey, what are you doing at 8:39 tonight?" I'm like, "I'm in bed, bro." He was like, "Bed." He was like, how do you do anything? I'm like, "Bro, I am in his bed. I get as much sleep as possible. It is one of my key things that I do."
Yes, and it is you need a certain amount of sleep. One of my TEDx coaching clients is doing a TEDx on how the idea of resilience is killing us, because the body is like a battery. You need to, at some point, it doesn't need more espresso. Right. It needs to relax and recharge. Mm-hmm. And it actually shrinks the prefrontal cortex, and there are changes in your brain when you are, what do they call burnout? Right. So diet, exercise, good night's sleep, medication. I take a little bit of antidepressant, and I got lucky. The first one they prescribed worked. I tell people, look, if you're taking some kind of psychotropic and it ain't working, nowadays there's a DNA cheek swab test like Ancestry. They take your DNA and they try to match it to whatever psychotropic works best with your metabolism for whatever condition you're dealing with. So it's much more precise, a lot less experimentation. So diet, exercise, good night's sleep, medication, twice a day. I have a thing it's called the cat napper. It's a 29-minute guided meditation. The guy takes you down, and then brings you back up. You'll awake refreshed. And I do that religiously twice a day, usually following a meal. And it's just, it's like the old days when the computer wasn't working and the tech would go, unplug it, plug it back in. That's kind of what it's like. Unplug it. Okay, now plug it back in. And it's, it's restorative. So that's and I think everybody should have a self-care plan. I believe the best healthcare is self-care.
Totally agree. We created something, or I created something called the SHIT Guide, SHIT, and it is your self-care documents. I'm going to send it to you. So S is for self-care, and it has 3 things, which is physical, emotional, and mental, right?
Yep.
And we might say that mental and emotional sort of cross over, and the physical, is a thread through that. But, write down 1 to 3 things in each of those sections, which you can do this week, which is going to contribute to those being taken care of. Physical health, your mental health, your emotional health. H stands for happiness. Write down between 1 to 5 things that make you happy. Right. And you don't have to have 5 things. You don't have to have 1 thing, but, right. And it doesn't have to be so, out there in the universe, this makes me happy, where the world is peaceful. It makes me happy? Eating this keto ice cream that I just had right now.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't had one of those in a while. Right. I stands for inspiration. Right. And think about friends, family, relationships, the world you live in, the work that you do, the purpose that you drive through, which inspires you. right? What inspires you? Write that down. And the trick to this is you got to write this stuff down, because when we just think about it, it doesn't sort of make it doesn't work as well as when it would when we write it down. And T stands for time, which says, okay, let's time this. So you've just spoken about stuff that's going to make you physically, mentally, and emotionally better. You've spoken about stuff, or you've written stuff down that's going to make you happy. And you've written stuff down that inspires you. Now look at the next week. You've got 7 days. Go and schedule some of those activities throughout the next week. It's cool. It's a cool document.
Yeah.
All right. So with that being said, Frank, really interesting. And thank you, one, for sharing your story. You were open. And I think, to all the listeners out there, hopefully we'll get some people in touch with you and being able to recognize that there are answers and solutions, and they're not alone out there. And, it's not this weird thing. Suicide is extremely common, right?
Yeah.
We spoke about how, that is also a selfless position and act, which is, I'm usually doing one for others. We spoke about sort of the signs we can look for, maybe some of the practices and the questions that we can ask. Amazing. Thank you. When it comes down to getting in touch with you, where could people find you? And if they wanted to watch some of your TEDx talks, where could they find that stuff?
Website is The Mental Health Comedian, or The Mental Health Comedian, as we say down south.
Right.
The Mental Health Comedian. All my stuff is there. All my contact information is there. And we, two co-authors and I, have written a 4-book series on men's mental health, because one of those folks, Sarah Garrett, MA, wanted to give she teaches suicide prevention to first responders. She wanted to give the gentleman a book on men's mental health and couldn't find one. Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
Really?
And so she thought, well, there's a vacuum. So it's a Chicken Soup for the Soul style anthology. Each book has 12 guys. Each guy has a different problem, issue. And each guy tells how he is actually coping with it, because that's what men told us they wanted. Real guys, real problems, and how they're really coping. And we thought we'd be lucky, Greg, if we could get 10 guys to come clean about some emotional whatever problem. And we ended up with 60 guys. One book became 4 books. And so the first one on my website, I did the narration. I'm going to narrate them all, unabridged narration, and it's free. Download the MP3 for free to hear the first book in that 4-book series on men's mental health.
Amazing. Thank you. And it's free. So we're going to list all of that. We're going to post it in the footnotes and make sure that people have access to it. And it's amazing that you're giving that away. And what a great resource. Again, I think the other key to what we spoke about is there's resources out there, right? And
yes,
advantage of them. At the end of each episode, we come to a very important question, which is, what do we all need to do to be better humans? And if I was to ask you, what do you think we could all do to be better humans tomorrow? What comes to mind?
Well, as we talked about, the good news is 8 out of 10 people who are suicidal are ambivalent. 9 out of 10 give hints in the last week leading up to an attempt, which means you can make a difference. You can save a life, and you can do it by doing something as simple as we're doing right here, now that you have the information, by starting a conversation.
It's amazing, Frank. Awesome. Frank King in the house. You were a pleasure to chat to. And again, thank you for sharing your story. With that being said, to the audience, if you like today's episode, don't forget to like it, don't forget to share it, and don't forget to subscribe it, and we will see you next time. Hey, thanks for listening today. And if you enjoyed today's episode, you're going to love the next one.